Otis, thank you very much for agreeing to this conversation. I'd like to start by just asking you to tell me a little bit about yourself and your background, where you're from, and what sort of research interests you most.
Okay, thank you. I'm from Africa, Zimbabwe to be precise. I came into the UK about 15 years ago. I decided to go back into studying around 2011. Studied international development. During the course of my studies, I recognized that I was interested in one of the units called gender. That then fed into my interests, which aligned to harmful cultural practices. I then pursued a study that was for my master's around 2014-2015, looking at the role that the religious leaders, especially the imams, have on the communities that they lead. The emphasis of the research, what I was trying to find out, if the imams could influence or change of opinion, or if they could influence their communities, especially when it comes to government engaging minority communities. If the imams could be a voice against it, or being used as a catalyst in reducing cultural practice, or especially harmful cultural practices.
Yeah. So you were focusing the study on Pakistani and Somali communities in Birmingham.
Yes.
And I'd be interested to know what was learnt from the study and whether the study findings were sort of fed back to the imams or the communities and helped them to understand what could be done.
What I found was that the imams, they said previously, prior to new government legislation, their role in terms of they're quite powerful in their role. They're quite powerful in the message that they convey to the communities. They are held highly by their communities. But when it comes to issues like FGM, issues like forced marriage, or any issues that are deemed illegal, the imams' hands were tied. They felt that government, through certain legislation, had limited their influences on their communities. They felt that they were being monitored. Their sermons were being monitored. So they felt that their influence was being curtailed in a way. That's from the imam's point of view. Whereas their communities felt that they still held, they were still hold power. They still hold power. So when it comes to engaging, as much as the government wants to engage imams as the gatekeepers, the problems that then comes out is that the imams are not free to articulate their feelings to their communities. So it's a catch-22 here. That's what my research points to.
Yeah.
Going further, I then went on to do a research, which I'm currently doing. The research is looking at the influence that globalization, urbanization, and migration have on cultural practice, specifically on bride price. I was looking at Zimbabwean communities in Birmingham, back home in Harare, and in rural Zimbabwe. What I found was that the issue of culture is significant. This is in a critique of what some authors, Chandra Mohanty, Uma Narayani, they in their studies, they point out that culture wasn't much of an influence, but my studies point to the contrary, that culture is at the heart of everything that these communities practice. So bride price is sort of an identity, sort of a form of identity. Even when people migrate, even when people come to England, they still practice bride price. It's still part of who we are. It's still part of the Zimbabwean culture. And what I also find intriguing was that those who are the so-called educated, even the so-called educated people, the so-called educated women within the Zimbabwean communities, were still advocating for the continuation of bride price, despite acknowledging, on the other hand, that it was harmful, that it endorses gender inequality.
It's really interesting, and when we were talking earlier, you were saying that even in the second or third generation, even though there might be an increased recognition that these practices are wrong or harmful, some of them, that there was still an adherence to these cultural practices.
Yes, I interviewed first, second, and third generations. What I found intriguing as well was that the younger generation, as much as they did acknowledge that bride price was harmful, that bride price was a cultural practice that needed to be challenged, but they still felt that they needed to abide by it as a way of pleasing their families, their parents.
And I think one of the things you mentioned to me was that to some extent those who migrate, the cultural influences become more entrenched in some ways. It'd be interesting to get your thoughts on why that is, but also on the part of the study that was in Zimbabwe, for those in the rural and urban communities that you studied. Was globalization having any kind of impact and changing practices there, either with practices being more entrenched or people becoming more liberal and open?
The first part of your question, those in the diaspora, those in Birmingham, the issue of bride price comes as a form of identity. When people migrate, because there's a misconception that when people migrate, they do away with their cultural practice, which is not the case. What I found is that people actually, they actually hang on to elements of their culture because it's a form of identity. So these cultural aspects are somehow exacerbated. They've got something to hold on to, regardless of the fact that they've become modernized, they've sort of become westernized, but they still hang on to those elements of their culture. It's not only confined to Zimbabweans, even other African countries, even other nationalities that have come to England, they still practice elements of their culture. It's about identity. Going back to the second part of your question, where people who have moved from rural to urban areas. Rural areas, it's somehow strict in the sense that elders they live in the rural areas. They are the custodian of culture. They'll be watching what's happening. Whereas in the urban areas, there's somehow what I would term freedom. People are going to the urban areas to work. There isn't much support networks. And there's the issue of people being sort of independent, if I may to put it. So that's the main difference. The other difference that I also find to counter is that the globalization of kind of commercialized bride price, which then brings in the question of legitimacy and relevance. Because is it whether the increase in bride price still makes it applicable as it used to be in old days?
And it's really interesting because in those three different contexts, the rural, the urban in Zimbabwe, and the migrant situation in Birmingham, presumably the findings of the study points to different responses or different sort of policy actions that could be desirable. I wonder where you see this going and what happens with the study findings, how they can have an impact, and what you would like to do next.
What I would say is the three contexts points to the fact that people still advocate for the continuation of bride price, despite the state suggesting that bride price could be banned in future. Because the problem with banning cultural practice like bride price, you merely driving them underground. It's about changing people's mindset. It's about involving people from the grassroots. It's about educating people. It's about involving these people in decision making, in highlighting why one might feel that bride price is harmful. So I would say changing mindset is key, but it's equally difficult to change people's mindset, especially when it comes to something that they value. Bearing in mind that marriage is at the heart of Zimbabwean bride price is at the heart of marriage, and marriage is at the heart of Zimbabwean culture. Culture is so embedded in Zimbabwe's way of life.
So, what are your own plans for future research? You're going to sort of build on this study in Zimbabwe, or take the findings into a different context? Or
funding permitting, I would want to explore the areas where, especially in Malawi, where men don't pay bride price, but they move, they go and live with the wife's family. The children take over the family's, the wife's surname. So I would want to find out whether there are elements of gender inequalities there, or what is the main difference between patrilineal and matrilineal society.
Right, that sounds...
Because here I'll be trying to measure the impact that bride price has on the lives of men and women.
Well, thank you. That sounds really interesting agenda. And I'll just conclude with one final brief question in terms of, I mean, you must have your own kind of motivations and interest in this. And but what would you really like to see happen? What changes would you like to see? What would greater equality look like, whether it's in a patrimonial or... Sorry, I've messed up this question.
Yeah. What I would like to see is equal opportunities where women are able to realize their potential, where women are not marginalized, where I would say if Zimbabwean or Africans at large feel that bride price is important, I would feel that maybe we need to go back to the good old days where a token of payment was given at the point of marriage, just a token of payment, just because one of the purposes of bride price was to bring the two families together. So my take would be, instead of the men's family paying to the girl's family, I would rather both families pay, just exchange something, not to pay.
Some gifts.
Because if you pay, you are purchasing. Payment, to me, my understanding of payment is you are purchasing. That then brings inequality on its own. So I would rather the two families exchange tokens, exchange gifts, just a small gift, at that point of the so-called union, as I meant to put it. Because bride price, the word price is you are attaching a value in a human being. So that, to me, kind of brings these issues of gender inequality, because the men will then feel that they've bought the woman, regardless of how people would want to sugarcoat it. But that's my understanding. Having lived, I was born in a practicing community. So I think, speaking from that point of view of being an insider researcher, I would feel that it involves a sober discussion with elders, not only sort of an imposition, but elders, the chiefs, the leaders, community leaders being involved in mapping out the way forward. But the way forward will then bring about how Bride Price started, going back to the good old days, just a token of payment, token of exchange of gifts.
Well, Ottis, thank you very much. It's been a fascinating conversation, and there's many more questions and ideas we could explore, but I think that gives a really good sense of your interests and your research, and has been a really interesting conversation. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, John.